But regardless of where we're at in life, and as difficult as a situation we might be in, we may not be able to change much, but we can choose our response. And that concept is so empowering, especially if I'm stuck.
Welcome to Season of Stuck, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the all-too-human experience of feeling stuck. I'm your host, Deanna DeBera, and on this podcast, we explore all things stuck. How and why stuckness happens, what it feels like, how to learn and grow from it, and ultimately, how to get unstuck and move forward in an authentic, empowered way. If you are looking for insights, support, and community as you make your journey from stuck to unstuck, you're in the right place. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Season of Stuck. I am your host, Deanna. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. And if this is not your first time listening to the show, welcome back. I know I say this in every episode, but that is because it's true. I am so grateful that you're here and that we get to explore the different ways we get stuck, what that feels like, and ultimately how to get unstuck together. So thank you for being on this ride with me. So today we are going to talk about something that I was first introduced to in the early stages of my career and has been helpful to me both professionally and personally ever since. And that is the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. As mentioned, I was first introduced to this book in my early 20s. And at that time, I was not the most effective, to put it mildly. Now, part of that stemmed from the fact that I just never really established good habits in school. I was always fairly smart, but I never had the systems or processes in place that I needed to be successful academically. In high school, I was completely disorganized, like books tumbling out of my locker disorganized. I didn't prioritize my schoolwork, and I basically coasted on my baseline intelligence and the fact that my teachers generally liked me. And then when I got to college, as I have talked about on the show quite a bit, I started drinking a lot, like a lot. And you know what doesn't set you up to be super effective and productive and successful at work or in life for that matter? That's right, excessive drinking. My drinking made me one of the least effective humans imaginable. I was unreliable. I didn't know what I wanted. I got overwhelmed easily. I didn't know how to collaborate or how to prioritize effectively. The list goes on, all of which made me not the most attractive employee. But still, despite that, I always had jobs. And it was at one of those jobs that someone gave me a copy of The 7 Habits. Now, at the time, I was still drinking. So while I skimmed the book, I wasn't quite ready to absorb the message. But I remembered that I found it interesting. So when I stopped drinking a few years later and felt ready to really start my career, I circled back to it. And I found it so helpful. The habits gave me a framework for growth. And while I originally looked at them through a professional lens, in the years since, I've come to realize that these habits aren't just about being effective at work. They're about being effective as a human being. So, what exactly are these habits, and how can they help you get unstuck? As the name suggests, the 7 habits are a set of principles that were originally identified by Dr. Stephen Covey, a well-respected businessman, professor, and speaker who spent decades studying people and organizations in order to identify the habits that empowered people to consistently hit their goals, create positive change, and ultimately be more effective across the board. He then published his findings in a book titled The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People in the late 80s. The habits are broken down into 3 categories. The first 3 habits are designed to help you gain independence. The next 3 are for gaining interdependence. And then the last habit is for maintaining the independence and interdependence that you've gained from implementing the first 6. We're going to go into each of the habits later on in the episode, but just to give you an example, Let's look at one of the habits that has been particularly helpful for me, both professionally and personally. And that is habit 2. Begin with the end in mind. Habit 2 is the principle of purpose. It's about having a clear vision and plan for where you want to go. And to say that I didn't have a clear plan or vision for my career or life in my early 20s would be a pretty dramatic understatement. When I was drinking, I was living day to day. I wasn't thinking about the big picture or what kind of life I wanted to build. I was thinking about how to get my next drink, or in more self reflective moments, how disappointed I was with myself. I wasn't dreaming. I didn't have goals. I was kind of aimless and sad. So, to sum it up, when I was drinking, I wasn't really concerned with the big picture. But when I stopped drinking, it became clear that I lacked both vision for the kind of life that I wanted and a plan for how to get there. And without alcohol, suddenly that lack of vision and a plan felt like a problem. And so, when I reread The 7 Habits, for the first time in a long time, I really started to think about my purpose. Or, to use the words of the framework, I began with the end in mind. I mapped out who I wanted to be, what was important to me, what I wanted my life to look like the next year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. I defined my values, how I wanted to show up in the world, and what I wanted my impact to be. And then I created a plan for how to bring all of that to life. Now, to be clear, almost 15 years later, that plan has definitely changed and evolved and shifted. But habit 2 is still a major part of my life. To this day, I think about the big picture and who I want to be and where I want to go, both professionally and personally. Now, I'm a person that is always starting with the end in mind. In fact, if I don't have a handle on what gives my life purpose and meaning, or a clear vision of the future and a plan for how I'm going to get there, it is a clear sign that I'm feeling stuck. So, yeah, habit 2 has become a foundational part of my life, and it's been incredibly powerful for me. But what is it that makes these habits so powerful? Well, unlike VCRs, acid wash jeans, shoulder pads, and other products of the 1980s, the 7 habits have stood the test of time. They're based on universal principles that are just as relevant now as they were back then, and will be just as relevant 10, 20, 50 years in the future as they are today. These principles give us a framework to more effectively identify our path, make choices that align with that path, collaborate with other people, and take action to move forward in the best direction for ourselves and our lives. A framework that we can not only use to get unstuck right now, but to navigate any seasons of stuck we may experience in the future. I wanted to learn more about the 7 habits, and more specifically, how to apply the 7 habits as we make the journey from stuck to unstuck. And that is what brought me to today's guest. Todd Davis is a senior leadership consultant and thought leader at Franklin Covey, and an expert on the 7 habits, helping both individuals and organizations apply these transformational principles to their businesses, careers, and lives. He's also an author. Todd has written and co-written a number of Wall Street Journal best-selling books, including Get Better, 15 Proven Practices to Build Effective Relationships at Work. During our conversation, Todd and I talk about the 7 habits and how to leverage these habits as powerful tools for getting unstuck. In exploring the 7 habits and how to apply them to our own stuck journeys, we cover a lot of ground, including why simply acknowledging that we have choices, especially when we're stuck, can help motivate us to change, why focusing on what matters most can help us move forward when we feel overwhelmed and stuck, and why taking care of ourselves is absolutely essential for having the energy and resources to show up fully in all areas of our lives, and for getting unstuck as a result. So, whether you're familiar with the 7 habits or you're brand new to the concept, this conversation will offer helpful insights for anyone looking to get unstuck and create positive change in their life, which, let's be real, is all of us, right? Okay, let's jump into my conversation with Todd. Todd, welcome to Season of Stuck. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to have a discussion.
I am very excited to have this discussion. So, I read The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People shortly after I transitioned into kind of the professional realm, and it had like a very big impact on me. So, I'm really excited to dive back in. It's been a while. I've been in the professional world for some time to kind of dive back in and get reacquainted and also explore the habits through the lens of getting unstuck.
Great. Wonderful.
So, I guess to kick things off, I would love if you could introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about your work.
So, name's Todd Davis. I have been with Franklin Covey, the leadership organization, I'm starting my 29th year.
Wow.
So, I first read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People 30 years ago and said, I've got to go work for this company. No, it didn't happen that way, but I ended up working for what was then called the Covey Leadership Center. And then after a merger with Franklin Quest, we are now Franklin Covey. I've been there for 29 years, or starting my 29th year. And for the last 18 of those years, up until about 2 years, a year and a half ago, I was Franklin Covey's chief people officer on their executive team and overseeing the human resource function and some of the operations and things of that nature. I've been fortunate to see these principles that we're going to talk about today put into practice. And I will say, while I've got a long ways to go, the 7 Habits has, without sounding too dramatic, has really been and continues to be life-changing for me.
I love that. And you're already getting me reacquainted. For some reason, my brain was thinking the 7 habits of highly successful people, but it's actually the 7 habits of highly effective people.
And it's a nice mistake to make because the more effective we are, the more successful we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I guess for anyone listening who isn't familiar with the book or with the concept, let's talk a little bit about the actual habits. So, what are the 7 habits of highly effective people, and why are they such effective habits for getting unstuck?
Yeah. So Dr. Stephen Covey, who was the author of this work, I had the great honor of working directly with him for many years before his passing. He passed away about 12 years ago. And he made a point always that he did not invent the 7 habits. What he did was observe those people, those individuals and teams and organizations that seemed to continually be getting the results they set out to achieve and more, and really move along, not just focused on speed, but in the right direction, doing the things that they found were really what they had set out to do. And then he identified what these people did and identified the principles at work. And again, he didn't invent principles, they've always been there, and then put them into a form or a structure we call the 7 habits, so that we could talk about them on Deanna's podcast, so that we could work with them in our personal and our professional life. So, to your question now, the 7 habits are: first habit is to be proactive. It's the habit of choice. The principal work here is the habit of choice. Habit 2 is to begin with the end in mind. This is the habit of purpose. If habit 1 is, I'm going to make a choice to live my life how I want to live it, well, then I got to decide what I'm going to do with my life. So that's habit 2, the habit of purpose. Habit 3 is to put first things first. This is the habit based on the principle of focus. There's a lot of great things to do, and I got to decide what are the more important things to do that are really going to contribute to the life that I want. And those 3 habits form what we call the private victory, or the victory over self. They help us become trustworthy because we do what we say we're going to do when we're living those 3 habits. And then we move on to the next 3 habits, which habit number 4 is think win-win. This is the habit of abundance. This is the habit that tells us, while it's human nature to say, oh, I got to just focus on me and take care of myself first, and then maybe if there's anything left over, I'll worry about you. The habit of abundance, think win-win, is where we say, hey, how do we all win together? How does everybody on the team win? Or how does, in this relationship, how do we win together? Habit 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. This is the habit of respect. And right up there with that word respect, I think of empathy. Because in habit 4, if I want to think win-win and I'm working with Deanna, I want to say, okay, well, what's a win to her? That's the attitude. Well, the skill is then to seek first to understand and find out from Deanna what's a win for her. And then she likewise finds out what's a win for me. That's the skill. And if we do those 2 habits really well, the attitude and the skill, then we're ready for habit 6, which is synergize. This is the habit of creative cooperation or collaboration, where we can start to work on ideas way better than my idea was going to be alone or your idea was going to be alone. And together we can create something far better than either one of us had in mind. And then surrounding, I'm picturing this visual here of what we call the maturity continuum, surrounding these 6 habits is habit 7, which is sharpen the saw. And this is the habit of renewal. This is the habit that says, I got to invest in myself physically, mentally, social, emotionally, spiritually, so that not because I'm selfish, but because by doing so, I have that much more energy and resource to give to everybody else. So that was probably not as quick as you wanted, but those are the 7 habits of highly effective people.
No, that is incredible. And I love how the habits, like the habit has a name, but then it also has a value that it's tied to, right?
Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that because often people will say, well, didn't he write about these almost 40 years ago? Yes, he did. And do you know that it continues to be one of, if not the best selling business book of all time, over 50 million copies? And I'm not here promoting books. I'm just saying to your point, the reason they are as relevant today as they were when Dr. Covey first wrote about them is because they're based on principles of effectiveness that endure. And so while the applications change in our work sessions, of course, we update and put situations in today's world to these habits. The habits themselves nor the principles ever change. So thank you for calling that out.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that I appreciate about these habits, and we can kind of dive into some specifics. But what's really standing out for me is that I would imagine many people were introduced to the 7 habits through a professional lens, through this is how to be more effective at work. But when you break them down in that way that is tied to like core principles and values, it feels like not only a blueprint for effectiveness at work, but a blueprint for effectiveness at life.
Could not agree with you more, Deanna. In fact, we begin when we're teaching the course that's tied to the book and all of that, we talk about the whole person paradigm. And when I say no longer, I don't know if it was ever intended to be that in the work setting, you also were very aware of people's personal lives and things like that. But I know when my dad was growing up in that, it probably, there was kind of like the dads and maybe the moms back then, but went to work and then come home and they kind of have their professional life and their personal life. And now more and more, the generations that are growing up, they want whole person paradigm approaches. And so you're exactly right. And these principles sometimes, I want to be careful here because it is through the professional environment, but sometimes have a greater impact, even more so in your personal life, because they address the very core of who you are, which then, of course, shows up in the workplace. But it's a huge, can make a huge difference in your personal life. One other thing I just thought of that happened last week, I was teaching a client down in California, a very large organization, and this person, his name was Ross, if you're listening, and he is the head of the L&D for this company. And Ross is about mid-50s, I would guess. Don't be offended, Ross, if you're listening and you're younger, but about mid-50s. And he came up to me after and he said, Todd, my son just graduated from college up in Portland, where you're from, or near where you're from. And he emailed me or called me and said, Dad, I just read the greatest book. This is his 22-year-old son. He said, Dad, I just read the greatest book. I'm going to send you a copy of it. And Ross said to me, I said, what book is it? And he said, it's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Ross said, do you know how long that book has been around and how much? Ross is a big fan. And again, just reiterating the point that this 22-year-old recent college grad was as excited about it as I get. And I read it 30 years ago.
Well, some things are just not only universal, but timeless.
Yeah.
Like, of course, the world of work, the world in general has changed dramatically since this book was written. But breaking it down to the core principles of effectiveness, like being an effective person and like the path it takes to get there, is very similar to when it was originally created. It's just the external looks a little different.
You're exactly right in my experience.
So I want to dive into how these habits can be used for navigating stuckness. But first, I think it's important, since we're talking the 7 habits of highly effective people, I think it would be helpful to give listeners like a working definition of what an effective person is. So like, what is kind of the end goal of the 7 habits?
Okay. And I promise that all of my answers won't be as long as they have been, but I love that you asked that question. So whenever I'm facilitating a discussion around the 7 habits, I bring up the old, I don't know if it's a metaphor or a fable of the goose and the golden egg. The farmer goes out and has this goose, he sees this golden egg and thinks it's a joke, but takes it into market and cashes it out and finds another one the next day. And he gets so excited that he cuts off the head of the goose because he wants all the golden eggs. He wants more and more. And of course, there are no more golden eggs, and he's killed the very thing that produces the golden eggs. And I bring that up when you ask about effectiveness, because we define effectiveness as, yes, we want results today. We want the life we want. We want everything we want today. And that's great, but let's get it in a way that allows us to get even better results over and over again in the future. So sometimes, because of our anxiousness or even greed, we kill the very thing that would produce the long term results. So that's one way I like to talk about effectiveness. And these people who are truly effective, again, success has a big part of it, but I like thinking about the metaphor of putting the compass over the clock. Dr. Covey used to talk about this all the time. In other words, it's important that we get the career we want while we're still within a certain age range, or that we get this thing we want. But sometimes in our hurriedness to get those things, we don't pause and say, what direction are we going in? Or is our ladder leaning, we climb the ladder, but is it leaning against the right wall, both in our personal lives and in our professional lives? So effectiveness is not just getting results, but getting the right results, the results that are leading you to the life you really want.
And also, I would imagine results that are sustainable. I feel like in today's culture of work, or even just today's culture in general, we're so focused on productivity and on output and on getting as much done in as little time as possible. And that leads to people burning out. So maybe you get a short term result, but it's not sustainable. Whereas taking the approach of building effectiveness over time in a way that can keep you moving forward professionally and personally, it feels like an important piece of the puzzle.
Completely agree. Putting the right systems and processes in place. So it's not like, oh yeah, we got there, but we got there because everybody worked 80 hours that week, and we got to do it over and over again. And in our personal lives, like you're talking about, I want to make sure that we emphasize that. This whole notion of habit 7, sharpening the saw, renewing ourselves on a regular basis, not on a wait till I crash and burn and then I'll just lay on the sofa for 2 days and recapture or recoup and then go back again. But it's no, how can I build in patterns in my life so that I'm renewing myself in these areas so that, to your point, it is sustainable?
Well, I am 100% a saw sharpener.
Good for you.
I went through a period. I've always been like a hard worker, but I went through a definite period where I was almost addicted to work, and I was just grinding, working every day, 7 days a week, building my business. And inevitably, and not shockingly, it led to a serious case of burnout. And I realized that if I wanted my career and my life to be sustainable over the long term, that I had to find some balance. And it's really been in this past really year that I have focused on creating that balance through doing things that fill my cup and really accepting that when my cup is full, I have more to give, not draining it until there's nothing there. And then all I can do is crash on the couch and watch Netflix for 12 hours.
As fun as that can be sometimes.
Yes, that can be renewing sometimes. It's definitely a part of my renewal plan.
I think as you're bringing this up, I bet everybody who's listening can relate to that. I just read a study a couple of days ago that said let's see, it was 53%, so more than half the population don't focus on investing in themselves until they're out at a burnout or a health crisis type level. So more than 50% of the people do just the wrong thing. And I've certainly felt myself getting close to that sometimes where, you're killing yourself. And yes, you enjoy the work and you love to feel valued and you love it that people need you, but then you crash and burn. And in my case, I was telling somebody this the other day, I booked too much in 2 weeks. And so I was gone every night. And I have a family, I have some kids and grandkids. And I finally, this 2 week crash of work things was over. And I was like, in a state of vegetation that whole weekend. And I thought, wow, the people I love and care about the most got kind of my leftovers. I gave everything else out there in the week. So to your very point, we want to make it sustainable, not just so that we don't burn out, but then we can, like you said, give our best selves. So we can do so much better.
Well, and thinking about it through the lens of stuckness, it really feels like this seventh habit is important because when you are stuck, whether you're feeling stuck at work, whether you're feeling stuck in your relationship, your personal growth journey, like wherever it is that you're feeling stuck, in order to navigate your way out of that, you need to be resourced. You need to have that full cup because otherwise, getting unstuck takes momentum by definition. And it's really hard to build any momentum if you are running on empty.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In Habit 7, we talk about, there's an assessment we have people do, but I could just tell your learners, just assess yourselves right now in these 4 dimensions: the physical, the mental, the social, emotional, and the spiritual. We find that those 4 dimensions, because I know at times in my life where I have been totally renewing myself in the physical. I was training for some marathons with some friends and eating right and doing all these things. Hopefully I'm still doing a little bit of that. But I didn't realize that, so that leg of the 4-legged stool was fine. And in the mental, where I'm staying current and reading and stimulating memory, that was fine. And in the spiritual, and people define spiritual all different ways, but what helps me feel like I'm contributing to society and adding value and what is my passion, that was fine. But the social emotional, the deposits, we call them, in the emotional bank account of others, the relationships, that's the one that I thought, oh, that's the leg of this 4-legged stool that's short. And it can be different for everybody. And maybe a couple of legs are short at one time, but evaluating those 4 areas I have found really helps me to stay fulfilled and feel like I do have the gas in the engine to do all those things that I really want to do and that are meaningful for me.
You love podcasts, and so do I. I am always on the hunt for new podcasts, and I've got some good news for you. I have found a podcast that you are going to love. It's called Blue Sky, and it's hosted by Bill Burke. Each week, Bill chats with inspiring people who are tackling the world's toughest challenges with a fresh dose of hope and optimism. Created by the Optimism Institute, Blue Sky is here to balance out all of the doom and gloom we see in the media by offering a positive, forward-thinking view of the future. From climate change to AI, homelessness to immigration, Bill and his guests cover it all, bringing in diverse perspectives that leave you feeling inspired and uplifted. Every episode reminds you that no matter how cloudy things seem, there's always a blue sky above. It's all about shifting your perspective and finding hope in even the hardest conversations. So, if you're ready for a podcast that leaves you feeling good about where we're headed, check out Blue Sky on any major podcast platform. It's the perfect way to clear the clouds and embrace a brighter future. And really, what's better than that? I love that framework for assessing your renewal strategies because I have also been in that same position where I have a few areas of my life that are really thriving, but I'm neglecting some other areas. And so that keeps me stuck or pulls me away from that feeling of balance. So I love that kind of rubric for evaluating where you might need a little more attention, where you're doing really well. Okay, so we've talked about habit 7, which seems like a really important piece of using the habits to get unstuck. But from your experience, overall, how can people leverage these 7 habits as a tool, as a support on their journey from stuck to unstuck?
Yeah, such a great question. You should do this for a living. You're really good at these questions.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think when I got this invitation and saw what your podcast is all about, I just thought, oh, this is perfectly aligned. So, a couple of things come to mind when you say that. Dr. Covey made the point that he never perfected himself in any of the 7 habits, nor do I think anybody ever does, but it's in that pursuit and that mindfulness and being aware of those things and striving to get better and better at them that the real effectiveness and reward comes. So, to your specific question, it starts with habit 1. Be proactive, the habit of choice, because when I first read the book 30 years ago, this sentence, I can still see it, sticks out to me. You can choose your response to any situation. And that was so empowering. And I want to be careful here to not have that cross over into a mindset of our life is just a circumstance of our choices, because that's not always true. And that can be dangerous. I have no idea what you have been through in your life or what you're dealing with now or what anybody is. So it's not for any of us to look at anyone else and say, well, they should have just chosen better or whatever. But regardless of where we're at in life, and as difficult as a situation we might be in, we may not be able to change much, but we can choose our response. And that concept is so empowering, especially if I'm stuck. If I feel stuck in my career or I feel stuck in a particular relationship, I can make a choice. Now, let's talk about relationship for a minute. I can make a choice, say, well, okay, get out of the relationship. Well, no. Or I can make a choice to say, I'm going to evaluate why I'm feeling stuck. I can make that choice. I can evaluate why I'm feeling stuck. And gosh, are there things I can do to make this relationship as rewarding as it once was or as I hoped it would be? So, and I know this a phrase I use often, says easy, does hard. Easy to talk about when you're in the real situation, but the mental choice is easy. We have to pause and think about it. So it starts there with habit one. And again, I won't just go through the 7 habits again, but I think if I'm stuck in a role at work or I'm stuck in a particular situation, feeling that way, I make the choice. Well, then habit two, begin with the end in mind. What would I like it to look like? And just visualizing that. We do this in the work sessions. We do this really cool activity called backcasting and instead of forecasting. And we have people fast forward anywhere from 3 months to a year where they have achieved the goal that they'd really like to achieve. So everybody comes up with a goal, or they've already got one probably, and then they pair up with people and they talk about they've just achieved the goal. And it can feel a little bit awkward, but you're saying, oh, I planned for years to run that marathon, and gosh, I crossed the finish line and everybody was cheering and I couldn't believe I did it. Or I found the perfect mate, for perfect partner, whatever, and they talk about what it feels like. And people come out of that activity saying, I can do this. This is going to be worth the payoff. So anyway, I'm probably getting this off track, but that's what comes to mind when I think about getting unstuck.
I love these. And what's so interesting is as you're talking, I'm realizing that I have been leveraging the 7 habits to get myself unstuck, but just not thinking about it through that lens. Like visualization is a huge thing for me when I'm feeling stuck. We did an episode with Hal Hirschfields, who is a professor at UCLA. He is an expert on kind of behavioral decision making, and he wrote this book called Your Future Self. And it's all about how tapping into this future self, like to your example, the future self that has already run the marathon, the future self that has already found the perfect partner. It's tapping into that person and thinking about them as you make your decisions today that can lead to you growing into that person and having it become the present version of you. And so that's something that I do all the time is like connect with that future version of myself and like write letters to myself as if I'm that future version. And that can really help me kind of unwind those feelings of stuckness in the present. So I love that tip. And I also loved what you said about habit one, which is be proactive. I think that for me and for a lot of people that I talk to, one of the core foundational characteristics of stuckness is this feeling like there are no choices, that you are just stuck where you are and you can't see a way out. You can't see the forest for the trees. But to your point, there is always some sort of choice that you can make, even if it's just choosing how to respond to the situation that you're in. And grabbing onto those choices almost feels like you could use it as a ladder to climb your way out of stuckness, choice by choice.
Couldn't agree more. And in each of the habits, when we teach or facilitate the work session, we talk about various practices. There are lessons in each habit. And one of the lessons in habit one, be proactive, is to use proactive language. And some people hear that and think, oh, okay, so if I just talk positive, everything will be fine. Not saying that. We're saying, look at the brain science. There are so many research studies that show the very language we use programs our brain to think more creatively and to come up with more opportunities. I don't know about you, but if you've ever worked with anyone, or even in your personal life, been with anyone who every good person, but everything is, oh, it'll never work, we can't do it, I have no choice, or what all that. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And not just because they're quote unquote negative, the brain shuts down. The creative portion of the brain shuts down and it just goes into this survival mode versus the person who says, okay, well, that didn't work, but I'll bet we can figure this out. Let's figure out a different approach, or how could we do this, or what is possible? And for those people, not just because they have the good fairy watching over them, but their brain opens up to all sorts of possibilities. And so it starts this climbing. I love your visual of climbing out of the hole of the ladder. It starts with the very language we use.
Words are so powerful. The way that we not only talk to others about what we're experiencing, but the way that we talk to ourselves. That, or I'll speak for myself. When I am running with a really critical internal dialogue, it makes any experience of stuckness so much worse and so much harder to navigate and ultimately get out of, because these stories that are running in my head are so negative or self critical or judgmental. And when we can shift the way that we talk to ourselves and infuse that internal dialogue with kindness, compassion, empathy for ourselves, I feel like you said, it just opens up our brain to create more of that and support us as we do whatever it is that needs to be done to get ourselves unstuck. The internal is then reflected externally, in my experience.
Totally agree. And you shared something a minute ago that I thought, oh, that's a really good idea, that you write letters to yourself. And I think similar to this backcasting exercise we do, we're talking to someone else about what it feels like to have succeeded. And that's powerful, but I think it's really powerful to write things down. There's just some magic in putting those words on paper. So I like that you shared it. It really does transform not just my outlook, but what I'm actually able to do and start doing.
I am the same way. There's something about putting pen to paper for me. If I'm stuck in internal thought loop, if I'm spiraling, if I'm stuck in self judgment or criticism or whatever the case may be, it's almost like as I put the pen to paper, I'm not just writing down what's going on in my head, I'm releasing it onto the paper. And it like creates a lot of clarity, which then helps me feel less stuck.
Really couldn't agree more. One other thought I had while you were talking, Deanna, is we've talked about habits 1 and 2 as far as getting us unstuck, being proactive, having the choice to realize we have the choice, and then deciding what we want to do with our lives. And then I jump up to habit 4, think win-win, because while most people, if they're stuck, a lot of the time they've been these people pleasers their whole lives, and they're making sure everybody else around them wins, but they're not practicing enough self-care, or what's a win for me. And the habit is called win-win. And so it's just an area to check. If you're feeling stuck, it's great you have that empathy and that compassion for others. Don't lose that. But are you also showing and thinking about that compassion for yourself and wanting to make sure that you're getting out of this relationship what you want, or you're getting out of this work situation or this project or whatever, what you want, as well as the other people?
That is such a helpful reminder. You were basically describing the first 37 years of my life. Like, I have historically been very,
You seem like a giver to me.
yes, I am an Enneagram 2 through and through. And I have always been really conscious of making other people comfortable, making other people happy, making sure other people are winning. And it wasn't until well into my adulthood that I started thinking, okay, I obviously don't want to lose that part of me, but like, what about me? Like, what are my wins? Like, how do I make myself feel comfortable or cared for or loved or whatever the case may be?
Yeah. And again, many people, I shouldn't say most, but many people you meet, they do okay thinking about themselves first and then other people. But there are a group of people that maybe need to get a little bit more in balance of not being selfish, but putting yourself right up there as important as the people around you.
Absolutely. One question that I have, so in thinking about these habits, habit 3, put first things first. I feel like a place where a lot of people, myself included, can get stuck is in overwhelm. There's so much that needs to get done. It feels like such a huge leap from where they are to where they want to go, and they can get analysis paralysis, right? I don't know what to do first, so I'm just not going to do anything. So, for people in that situation, how can they use this habit to put first things first and prioritize what needs to be done in order to get unstuck?
Yeah. So without going into teach mode here, we use a model in habit 3 called the time matrix. And I can still share the concept here that will hopefully make sense to listeners. But in the time matrix, there are 4 quadrants, and each quadrant has a level of importance and urgency. And the main idea here is that in quadrant one, we call it the quadrant of necessity, everything is urgent and important. Okay, so that's an area we have to address that. It's urgent and it's important. But what you're talking about, what you're asking about, we would say quadrant three. These are things that are not important or not as important, but they're urgent. And we have been there for so long, we've convinced ourselves that anything that comes at us is urgent and important, rather. It comes at us, of course, it's urgent, but it's important. And so we end up filling up our bucket, if you will, with a lot of less important things or not as important as the most important things in our life because they come at us. And so the concept we teach here is quadrant two, which those are things that are important, probably the most important, but because they're not urgent, we have to act on them. And so what comes out of this teacher on the time matrix is identifying our highest priorities, which usually is our relationships in our life, some really meaningful goals, some compassionate work that we do, or contributions that we make to society. Those are the most important things. And we make sure that we're blocking enough time for those things. And a lot of those things can be ways that you earn money as well, and then let other things fill in. But we have to act on those things. And so if I'm stuck, like you said, because my task list is this long, I owe it to myself to take a weekend, take a night, prioritize everything and say, yeah, it's all worthy, but does everything have exactly the equal amount of value? No. So what are the most important things? Okay, are those the things that are filling up my calendar first? Because if they're not, I need to act on those things first. And it will, I speak from experience. I'm not perfect at any of this, but I've been fortunate enough to be here for so long that helps you to move forward on those things that matter most.
Ugh, I love that tool. And you brought up such an important point, which is that, and you actually touched on it earlier as well, is that oftentimes the things that are the most important, like a deep priority in like the larger sense of the word, fall to the bottom of the priority list because we are bogged down with all of these things that feel urgent, even if they're not important. And then the unfortunate fact of that is that you could do that every day and then blink your eyes and 10 years have gone by and you haven't worked on the things that are truly important to you. So I love that quadrant as a way to kind of say, okay, what needs to get done? What needs to get done now? Like, how can I make room for the things that are really important to me, even if they're not necessarily time sensitive? That feels like a very helpful tool for navigating stuckness.
Well, and in fact, I want to just emphasize what you just said, especially because they're not time sensitive. Because if they're the things that are really important to me, be honest with myself, they're not time sensitive. If I don't act on them, I'm going to put them off until it's too late. And that relationship is broken, or that opportunity for that project has passed, or whatever. So I owe it to myself because it's not time sensitive.
Yes, absolutely. I love that it's not even though it's time sensitive, but because it is time sensitive.
Yeah, it runs the risk. It's in the risky area of never getting that thing that you're going to kick yourself at the end of, a year or a decade or a life of not having done.
Yeah, 100%. Ugh, Todd, I feel like we have gone over so many useful ways to leverage the seven habits as a way to navigate stuckness and ultimately get unstuck. If someone is listening right now and is really interested in diving into the seven habits on a deeper level and using those habits to apply to their life and support themselves as they get unstuck, like what are your top pieces of advice for how to get started and how to leverage these tools?
Yeah. Well, I would first, I listen more than I read nowadays, so I listen to a lot of books, but I would first get the audiobooks of Seven Habits. I would start there, and then I would just do a self assessment compared to each of the habits and say, where am I? Where do I need more help? We work with organizations and companies, but it might be and I'm not here giving a sales pitch, I'm just sharing that they might want to go to our website, franklincovey.com, and just look up all of the tools that are available there with Seven Habits. And we have lots of people who'd be happy to give them and provide them more information.
Mm, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. Todd, this has been such an incredible conversation. I think it's so funny that I've been like unconsciously leveraging these tools in my own life. It goes to prove that like when you read something, even if you don't like consciously think of it, it can have an impact in the long term. So I'm very excited to now consciously take these tools and use them to support myself, not only in times of stuckness, but also just to be my most effective self.
Well, and I think that also speaks to what you're saying is that, it's been somewhere in our mind. It also speaks to the fact that these are based on principles. So those principles you've been practicing, Dr. Covey didn't invent those principles. They had been around forever. And so, but it is helpful to have a framework now around those and say, oh, and here's a more effective way to even put these to use.
Oh, 100%. I am a type A. I love a framework. Love it.
Me too.
Todd, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So, here on Season of Stuck, we have one question that we like to ask all of our guests. So, if it's okay with you, I just have one more question for you.
Sure.
Okay. So, thinking about your ideal future self, like the Todd that you are working every day to one day grow into, if he could travel back in time and talk to the present version of you, what advice do you think he would give you on how to navigate stuckness at this point in your life?
I love that question. And I think my advice to my younger self and my advice, which I give it a lot, is not crazy risk, but be willing to take a few more risks. Unless somebody's going to die or it's going to be the end of the world and you feel really strongly about doing something, don't hold back so much. That's what I would say to myself and to others that are maybe more of a wait and see mindset that I used to be. Life is this great journey we're all on. Dive in. And I'm not saying, take risks and lose your retirement or lose whatever, but take risks.
Yeah.
We are all so much more creative than we give ourselves credit for. And there is so much that everybody can do with their lives. So that would be my advice.
It's like the saying that I often hear, like most people don't regret the things that they did, but the things that they didn't do.
So true. Yeah, see, you answered the question in a few words. I took like a couple of paragraphs.
No, it was perfect. I love getting one of my favorite parts of every conversation is when I get to tap into these future versions of guests because without fail, they always come in with advice and insights and tips and strategies that are so helpful for me. So, from a selfish perspective, it is one of my favorite parts of the show. And I know that it is also really helpful for listeners. So, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I have learned a lot from you today. So, thanks.
And vice versa. Thank you so much for being here, Todd.
Thank you.
That's it for today. A huge thank you to our guests for their incredible insights. And a huge thank you to you, our listeners. We know that there are so many podcasts out there to choose from, and we are just so grateful that you chose ours. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider recommending the podcast to a friend or family member that you think would enjoy it. And to make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And while you're there, if you loved the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review. It plays such a huge part in getting this podcast out to a wider audience and ultimately supporting more people on their journey from stuck to unstuck. And to keep in touch and access even more stuck-related content, follow us on Instagram at Season of Stuck and visit our website, seasonofstuck.com, where you can sign up to get episodes delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you again for being here. It is so, so appreciated. Until next time, I'm Deanna DeBera, and you're listening to Season of Stuck.